Thanks so much for having me, and congratulations to all of you there. Well, talking about Ngũgĩja and his life, and I think you mentioned some of those things, key for us here is to know that in the year 1977, Ngũgĩja was detained by the post-independence Kenyan government. Yeah, that's almost 15 years after independence. Yeah, and he was detained principally because of his involvement in community theater. Yeah, he wrote a book, a play called When I Want, and this is what took him to prison, because it talks about, the post-colonial disillusionment. That's number one, and it's also an attack, a big attack on imperialism, and that's what landed him in jail in 1977. But not just about his work, but principally because his play was acted, in Kenyan villages using Kenyan language. Although there is an English version of the text, but originally the play was in the Gikuyu language, And the president then, Gikuyu himself, I think felt that his government was being attacked, directly, and they sent him to prison for that. So it's the case of Ngũgĩja is not unique in Africa. About a writer who has been involved in politics. In fact, when I'm saying this, I'm paraphrasing, a title of one of his books called "Writers in Politics." And I thought probably for us to begin, and to answer the question, and to understand the context in which Ngũgĩja writes, I would want, with your indulgence, I would want to quote a very short paragraph here from Writers in Politics, about 2 paragraphs from Writers in Politics to put us in context. And this is what Ngũgĩja says in his book Writers in Politics, that the writer as a human being is himself or herself a product of history, of time and place. As a member of society, he or she belongs to a certain class, and he or she is inevitably a participant in the class struggle of the times. As a writer in a given society, it does not make a difference whether he or she is allowed to write or not, whether what he writes is controlled or not, and whether he or she is espousing this or that class outlook. So I think that for me is key, And if you were to go back to the Makerere conference in 1962, when they started talking about the language of African literature principally, most of the writers who are there, like Chinua Achebe, Christopher Okigbo, Wole Soyinka of Nigeria, who himself, Block Modisane of South Africa, Eskia Mpatlele as well of South Africa, in 1962, most of them who were there eventually suffered, immensely under the post-colonial governments. If it was not death, for example, they killed Christopher Okigbo in Nigeria, for example, an author. If it's not death, it was exile. For example, the South African writers like Block Modisane or Eskia Mpatlele in South Africa. Or if not exile, then it was detention, like it happened to Ngũgĩja and Wole Soyinka as well. Yeah. So I think I think this is key. This is important for us not to talk about the writer in politics per se. And Chinua Achebe in his book has a very interesting quote that I would also want to cite here briefly. And he says, "It is clear to me that an African writer who tries to avoid the big social and political issues of the contemporary Africa will end up being completely irrelevant, like that absurd man in the proverb who leaves his house burning to pursue a rat fleeing from the flames. So that comes from Chinua Achebe's book, Morning Yet on Creation Day, again, to emphasize the importance of the writer, of an author, of literature to engage in politics, of the day. And to conclude, in this question, again, with another quote, I won't be quoting again, I found this quote, and probably they should be of interest to you, as Anna, because of your research interest in Ethiopia. I'm quoting Maza Mengiste, and I liked her quote that fiction gives us the truth that history cannot. Yeah, like history gives us location, place, dates, events, but fiction gives us the human being. Fiction gives us the person. I think that for me underlies, the key factor, for writers to engage in politics. And a grain of wheat for us, it's not just a creative piece, but in it is the history of Kenya embedded, in the characters, in the themes, in the style that Ngũgĩ presents the book. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, that is a good conclusion, quoting Maza Mengistu. So, A Grain of Wheat is historically based fiction, right? And which is not exactly historical in a sense of its plot, as you have already indicated, but it's very close to the historical truths, right, that happen in Kenya. So, can you elaborate a bit more on history and imagination in African novel of that time, in the generation of Ngũgĩ and others?
Well, I think for me, A Grain of Wheat, for example, or earlier works like The River Between by Ngũgĩ as well, or Chinua Achebe's Things For Apart, much as we want to read them, as works of fiction, there's lots of history there embedded, and what I like mostly with Ngũgĩ, for example, in A Grain of Wheat is that it's like he's writing the Kenyan history. We have names of real people, like Jomo Kenyatta, who was the first president of Kenya, like Harry Thuku, one of the pioneers of the struggle against British colonialism, or Wayaki, Chief Wayaki, these are real people who existed, and Ngũgĩ is using, their names, even not just the names of the people, even the names of places. When you talk about the fight, all these places exist, they are there. It could be fictional in the sense that it is a novel, but these places do exist. The events he's talking about, the construction of the railway, for example. These are historical events that did happen, But Ngũgĩ is not just leaving us there, to the history, and I'm going back to the quote by Maza about fiction also giving us the person, But Ngũgĩ as well, now gives us the fictional characters in the name of Mugo or Mumbi or Konyo or Warui, Wambui, all of them, But it's giving us a sense in which we can also rethink or revise, the role of the real people that he mentions, For example, what was the role of Jomo Kenyatta, or Kimagi? I forgot to mention, Kimagi, who is not mentioned by name now, but if you read through, if you go through, the history of Kenya, Dedan Kimathi is well represented here in the character of Kihika, although Ngũgĩ does not mention Dedan Kimathi, But there is a reason to that, 1967, when the book is published, Kenya is about 4 years old, and people are overjoyous, like we have a new Kenya, independent Kenya, free from colonialism. But at the same time, people started noticing that things were not going as they expected, So I would want to imagine, I have never checked this with Ngũgĩ, if he omitted the name of Kimathi, on purpose, because in Kenya, and probably I'll talk about this later, the history of the Mau Mau, which was the freedom movement, was suppressed. Immediately after independence, the government wanted us to forget about the Mau Mau, the struggle for independence, and that's why I would want to connect, I could be wrong on this, the character of Mugo to the real person, Jomo Kenyatta, who was the first president of Kenya. So Ngũgĩ is, in the characters, he's wanting us to question, or to rethink. I think the proper word here is to rethink, the role, or to reimagine the history of Kenya. Not just the way the history has been told about Kenya, but to reimagine it. But I think I like how he goes as well into the consciousness of the characters. What Mazak Gisto was talking about, fiction giving us person. Because history just gives us names, places, Jomo Kenyatta, state of emergency, Mau Mau, but when you go into the conscious of people like Mumbi, for example, or Gikandi, or Mugo, when you're rethinking so many other things, I think that is what Ngũgĩ is inviting us to think about. And I think the last one, he's also inviting us, to what Ali Matsui calls about to revise, or to re-examine the traditional concepts of heroism, of martyrdom, and villain. The character of Mugo, everybody thinks is a hero. At the end of the day, he's not. Or through betrayal, who Gikandi is, who Mumbi is, who Karanja is, and all those things. I think that is key. And Ali Mazrui, one of the key literary critics in East Africa, says that in the history of Africa, in the history of the struggle for independence, I think it is important to rethink, to revise what we call fathers of the nations. Interestingly, they don't talk about mothers of the nation. They just talk about fathers of the nation, be it Milton Obote of Uganda, or Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Leopold Senghor of Senegal, or Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, or Kamuzu Banda of Malawi, or more recently, names like Nelson Mandela. Like we have to rethink, revisit, or reimagine, that idea of a hero. I think for me the key story, the key theme in this is that to revise, rethink, reimagine, all these things. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so thank you so much. And a grain of wheat actually covers, as you have already mentioned, a very important period of Kenyan history. So we can read about the detention camps and displaced people and Kenya Land and Freedom Army and the liberation movement and Mau Mau and so on. So what is this historical knowledge that we actually need to have for the better understanding of the novel? Like, what is the historical context? I think that's an important question. I think it's also quite vast. I don't think we can be able to handle this, in this session. But I think the historical context is key. Which goes way back to 1884. The Berlin Conference, the partition of Africa, and then Kenya is taken over by the British. Which Ngũgĩ is talking about. But I think key for us here is to understand the history of the liberation movement, which is the Mau Mau. You mentioned it. I mean, it was a historical event that did happen, but that started primarily as a Kenya Land and Freedom Army. Okay, so back to the question about the historical context of
yes.
the period that novel is actually covering.
Yes. So I was at the point where I was talking about the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, which was a movement, a liberation movement in the fight against colonialism, and there were so many other movements, not just not just okay. Sorry, there now. Not just the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. We also had like what we call independent churches, that were involved in the fight against colonialism. We had like independent schools as well. So many. But I think the Kenya Land and Freedom Army is key because it took probably a more direct route in the fight against colonialism by the use of arms, because I don't think colonialism was going to be won, through pacific means, So the Kenya Land and Freedom Army was not, the main grievances could have been independence, but I think for me, my understanding, was land. Land is key, and it's very prominent in the book as well, because when the British took over Kenya, they apportioned themselves, the most fertile lands, they call it the White Highlands, and they pushed people in what they call here like small villages, and they go and work in the farms of the British. Sad to note, and that's why grain of wheat is important. Is that some of those farms, that the British owned, some of them are still there to date. 2022. That's about how many 60 years after independence. Like the British still control, some tracts of land in very productive areas. So land was key. So that's why they talk about land and freedom. So we get our land back, but also in a way we need to rule ourselves. And when it turned violent, the fight against colonialism, the British, started those what you call detention camps, which are equivalent of what you can call probably in European history, like concentration camps. It was not any different, between what they call detention camps, and the concentration camps, what we did in European history, So that is part of this context, and we see, Gikonyo in detention camp, Olmugo, and I think another another important thing to note as well is that when you're talking about resistance, against colonialism, but not everybody was against the British rule. Some Africans, some Kenyans were incorporated into the colonial system, and I think here it's represented by the character of Karanja, were incorporated in the system, to oppress fellow Kenyans, quite a number of them, and there comes all sorts of betrayals that we can talk about now in the case here. Going back to land, I think it is Ngũgĩja who said, that the colonialists came to Africa, with a Bible in one hand, and the gun in the other, and then he told them, let's close our eyes and pray using the Bible. And when they woke up, when they opened their eyes, all the land was gone. And land, it's an important factor, in talking about colonialism in Africa. But far away from the colonial system, the history of colonialism as well. I think it's also key to talk about the post-independence Kenya now. And the novel revolves so much around that, like lots of betrayal. I think we mentioned how, Jomo Kenyatta mentioned here, in very nice terms, several times in the book, when he got into power, he told Kenya that we have to forget, about the past and think about the future, This forgetting about the past is also forgetting about the memory of the Mau Mau, for example, the memory of people like Kihika, Pia, who I think for me is Kimathi, and Kimathi, in the book we get to know that the people who took over power, for example, it was getting very difficult, for example, for Kenyans to go and meet a member of parliament, in fact, somebody says, meeting an MP, it's like meeting God. It was very difficult to go and meet, the people who were supposed to represent you. So what are we saying here? That we have a change of government from the colonialists to the Kenyans now taking charge of their leadership, you know. But what are they doing? Probably they're doing the same as the colonialists did, you know, if not worse, you know. And the history of Kenya is the history of many African countries as well, you know. And I think lastly, you know, to talk about the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, which later morphed into Mau Mau, I think it's imperative to know that Mau Mau in the Kenyan law system was, what is the word I should use there, no? It existed, no, in the Kenyan law system as a terrorist organization until 2003. Imagine that. You know, many years after independence, the liberation movement was not registered, you know, appeared in the law books, you know, as a terrorist organization, just the same way as the British colonialist did. It's so many things not to think about that. And I think for me, then the translation of grain of wheat into, you know, like you can access this, no, is to understand not just the history of Kenya or of Africa, no, but as well as what is happening in contemporary in many parts of Africa as well. You know, Ngũgĩja is writing the history of Africa, not just the history of the Mau Mau. Okay, in my view. Thank you.
Okay, so earlier you mentioned how like Europeans came to Africa with the Bible in one hand, right? But throughout the book, like throughout the novel, there are many biblical references. Like Christianity is mostly embedded in the character of Ngũgĩja, and it has some kind of didactic role. While Ngũgĩja, as we know, like his clear reference in this book is Fanon and Marxism and so on. So how shall we understand it from decolonial way of reading? Like, you know, this kind of mixture of Marxism and biblical references in the context of Kenya.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Interesting question. Now, in fact, I would invite you and the audience now, if you know, if you want to delve much into this question, I think it's clear in this book as well. Yeah, but in his two books, Devil on the Cross, you know, and I Will Marry When I Want. That is where it comes out strongly, you know, the use of religion. But I think Ngũgĩja, what is doing here, you know, and if we go back to a grain of wheat, the verses that, you know, Ngũgĩja highlighted. You remember in one part, Ngũgĩja is arguing as a small boy, you know, is arguing with the teacher, you know, because I think the teacher had like a very singular, you know, way of interpreting the Bible, you know, and Ngũgĩja is questioning him, you know. So like the verses that Ngũgĩja had underlined, you know, and which marked like the beginning of each chapter, you know. It's a very selective reading of the Bible, you know, a very selective reading of the Bible. But I think, you know, that's number one. And here I was also thinking about, for example, away from the book, I'm thinking about a movement like Rastafarianism, you know. They use the Bible, you know, but also a very selective way of reading, you know, we are not throwing away the Bible, you know, in its entirety, you know. There are some redeeming factors, could be, you know, or we could have a new interpretation of the Bible, you know, away from the dominant Christian way of looking at, you know, the Bible and the stories in the Bible, that they can form an inspiration. And Ngũgĩja is very good in this, in all his works, you know, the Bible. I think it's key for me when he's looking at the Bible, no. And I think another thing, it could be a way as well, you know, of mocking, you know, of mocking Christianity, of mocking religion of mocking colonialism, in the same way like Chinua Achebe talks about, like I will use English, it's been given to me by the colonizer, but I'll use it to talk about my African experience, And I think Ngũgĩja in the same way, when they're talking about the New Jerusalem, and all those things, he is using the Bible to talk about, an interpretation, but to talk about his African experience. I think a bit away from, or one can also talk about domesticating Christianity. Domesticating Christianity. Going back to the history of the liberation movement, we also know that, and I think they mentioned this in the book. Yeah, for example, the liberation movement, the Mau Mau, what they would do, or the churches, what we call independent churches, they would use, for example, Christian hymns and Christian songs, but to pass messages amongst themselves, and they would change completely, the wording, the wording of the hymn, and they would put in names there like Kemadi and Kenyatta, but in a way that the colonizer could not, they would just think that these are people in a normal church service, singing our hymns and everything like that, but they could subvert, so you give me a song, Onward Christians March, or other songs, but I subvert, everything about the song to talk about my very own experience, to pass messages. In fact, so many of those songs sung during Mau Mau, most of them are used, were derivatives, of the Christian hymn. So I think it's Ngũgĩja's way of subverting Christianity, in a very interesting way, and here we find it like through the character of Kihika, but I would now invite members of the audience, to also read, Almari When I Want the Play. It's wonderful, and Devil on the Cross. There, from the title, Devil on the Cross, Christianity talks about Jesus on the cross, but Ngũgĩja is putting Devil on the cross here, Very interesting stuff. Yeah, thanks.
We do not have these two books in Slovene translation yet, but of course you are welcome to read it in English. But Mainom, if we talk about the characters of the novel, I found myself sympathizing with all of them, right? Even with Mugo, who is a traitor. So my question is, which is your favorite character actually? Like, which is the one that like really catches your attention and sympathy and so on?
That's a very difficult question. I don't know how to answer that. I wouldn't know how to go about this, but I think, well, it's very easy to sympathize, to identify with Kihika, the story is all around him, but the story of Mugo, I have to, Mugo and Mumbi,
Seem like me, actually.
Yes, I don't know, the story begins with, Mugo felt nervous, those three words, key, important, and they capture so much, and we are going through the thought system of Mugo throughout the novel, and for him to actually come out, and I think Ngũgĩja here is playing games with Kenyans, because not so common history say that, Jomo Kenyatta, who was eventually the president of Kenya, actually betrayed the liberation movement, it is after the death of Kimadi, the arrest and the capture of Kimadi, I think in 1953 February. If there was a Kimadi at independence, probably he would have been president, and not Jomo Kenyatta, I'm saying if there was no Kihika, there would have been Mugo. or vice versa, you know. So I think, you know, and is it Gikonyo or Wamboi who says, you know, that is a brave, you know, is a brave person, you know, to actually come out and confess, you know, that I am the one who betrayed Keheka, you know, confesses this first to Mungi, you know, Keheka's sister, you know. And I'm thinking probably if the leadership that took over, you know, could have been as brave, you know, as Mugo, you know, and come up and confess to things they did that we never knew about, you know. Their claim to heroism, probably, you know, they would have told us, no, I am not a hero as you think I was, you know. So I sympathize with Mugo throughout the story. I think, not to say that he's my favorite character, but I see parallels también as well. Sorry, I'm speaking Spanish now. Parallels with sorry about that. With the character of Jomo Kenyatta. Number two, I think Mombi for me, having been a fan of Ngugi's books through and through, you know, the women characters come out like very strong, you know. And here I'm thinking, for example, of Warenga, you know, in Devil on the Cross, no, or Gadoni, I'll marry when I want, or is it Nyambura or Mudoni in the river between, you know. So Moby for me probably, and that's why Gikonyo at the end of the book, you know, he's trying to make a stool for her as a gift for her, probably trying to think about the future of Kenya, you know, the future of independence, African states, you know. That's why he's thinking, you know, he changes amidst his fears and anxiety, you know. The book ends that, you know, he thought about the wedding gift, a tool carved from weary wood. I'll change the woman's figure, I shall carve a woman. Big with child, you know. It is like, you know, talking about future, hope for the future amidst all the betrayals, for example, that Gikonyo went through. Moby also went through some betrayals, you know. Probably to talking about the future, but I draw connections with, you know, other women characters. For example, Warenga, Jacinta Warenga in Devil on the Cross, or Gadoni, you know, in I'll marry when I want. Yeah, that Ngugi is always leading us with that thinking, you know, like that puts the woman in the center of the theme of our history. And I think what Mombi went through, you know, and history is very patriarchal, you know. History never thinks about the struggles that women went through, you know. History is very quiet about that, you know. The history of the Mau Mau, it doesn't talk about women. And here I think I'm very subjective, very, very extremely subjective. My parents were part of the Mau Mau. This one I can say without, you know, fear or of contradiction, you know. And stories of my mother, you know, in the struggle, you know, and I've listened to that, you know, for many years, and I see that our history is very silent on the role of women, especially in Africa, the role of women in the struggle for independence. It's always very silent, you know, and I think Ngugi is inviting us probably to. That's why, eventually, to answer your question, I'll go with Mombi. That's my favorite term. Yeah.
Great. So, like, talking about Mugo, you somehow like emphasize the importance of confession, right? Which plays a very vital role in the novel, as well as like betrayal, trauma, expectations, and hopes, and both in terms of novel's characters and also in terms of nation building. So can we read, I mean, like, you already answered this question, like, partly, but can we read the book as some kind of political allegory?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, for example, the overriding theme of betrayal, you know, this is exactly talking about the post-colonial disillusionment, you know, the people who took over power just betrayed the people who voted them in. You know, and the successive governments that have taken over continue with this train of betrayal through and through and through and through. That's one. Through the theme. The different levels of betrayal that we have seen. Be it between Karandi and Gikonyo, between Mombi and Gikonyo, between Mogo and Kihika, between all the different levels for me. I see them, as a comment on Ngũgĩ, allegorizing, the disillusionment, the disillusionment, after independence, and still relevant, up to date, I talked about the opening, 3 words. Mogo felt nervous, and I think. And I hope I'm not misquoting Titi Garema, who talks about the nervous condition. It's again, that the new state. We're trying to build a nation state. And the new government is as nervous as Mogo. And probably that's why we don't get to to complete the process. Which I still think up to now, in many African states, we're still struggling, to create what you can call a nation state, many years after independence, so many other factors, internal, external factors, So I would want to see it in that. Number 3, I think, in talking about allegory, Ngũgĩ likes using allegorical names as well, So when you talk about Mombi, what does Mombi mean in Kikuyu? Mombi is like the one who creates. That's why I was talking about Mombi as a future, the one who creates. In fact, the mythical mother of the Kikuyu was called Mombi. Mogo talks about a seer, somebody who can prophesy or something like that, But I don't know how this Ngũgĩ in Devil on the Cross uses the allegorical names, very well. And some other names like Gidua, the man who is has one leg amputated. In Kikuyu, Gidua means exactly a person who walks like with crutches and stuff like that. Yeah. So as well as in the allegorical name, Keheka, I would want to go back to my lessons in Kikuyu and see and see if it's it would mean something like somebody who does something in a rush, But I don't know if that connects to Keheka in the text. Yeah. So political allegory through the naming, through this very deliberate efforts to mix, if I can say, the history as it exists, the real names. With the characters as well, So it's like calling us not to just juxtapose, the historical characters with the fictional characters, but in a way to see them like as one, and try to see how they interact as well, like in the understanding of the text, and ultimately, the last chapter, Gikonyo is trying to carve, a 3-legged stool, and I was looking at that 3-legged stool differently, talking about the allegory and stuff like that, because in the text there is always talking about Haretuku, Wayaki, and Jomo Kenyatta, So I don't know whether Ngũgĩ or Konyo, I don't know who, is inviting us, to think about the history of Kenya, and probably I'll change here, not just the history of Kenya, but the history of the Kikuyu people, alongside these key persons, Wayaki Wahinga, presenting, the very first, resistance towards colonialism, Haretuku is the very first organized resistance in 1920s, and then Jomo Kenyatta, but I don't know where that would leave. Dan Kimathi, who for me is the hero, much as we have to revise the heroism and everything, is the hero of Kenyan independence, according to me. Yes.
Okay. So maybe this is going to be my last question about the novel. And we can talk briefly about what inspired this book and how do you see intertextuality within it? Like there are some references, like, you know, for punctual readers or readers of African literature with Conrad and his novel Heart of Darkness and Under Western Eyes. So what is actually the role of intertextuality in Ngũgĩja's generation of African writers? I believe it's more than just a literary technique.
I found that question a bit difficult in several ways, but I think one, I always struggle when I'm teaching African studies here in Mexico. The first thing that we do is to denounce Joseph Conrad, no? Especially in the Heart of Darkness, you know. So I struggle. Well, I know I struggle to put Ngũgĩ and Conrad in the same. I struggle, but it is true. But I think, you know, not just Ngũgĩ, you know, even Chinua Achebe, you know. I mean, the Things Fall Apart. The title comes from a poem from Yeats, you know. But I think it was a key moment in the identity of African literature in the 60s, especially, you know. But that is not to say that we didn't have literature before that. No, we've had literature, but I think the 60s, the 1962 conference, especially, I think it was key. So my reading of intertextuality and the importance, I don't know how I can answer this per se, no? But I think it was key to rewrite, no? To revise, you know, the image. I think the image of Africa is presented by colonial literature like Joseph Conrad's and other people. I think it was key for them to pay the colonizer or the West by the same coin. You know, I'm gonna use your literary techniques and your but I'm gonna write my story. You know, using your same techniques and stuff like that. Yeah, but I always struggle. I have to confess that I have never read Under Western Eyes. I don't think I want to. I don't think I want to read it. No. So to make a very informed answer to that. But I think also what Ngũgĩ is inviting us to do, is the way he narrates the story. You know. Like we see, like very multiple narrations, very multiple voices as well, you know, that are telling the story, you know. Well, they talk about, you know, the that past, you know, the stream of consciousness and all all those things, you know. So this Ngũgĩ, I think, is inviting us, you know, in key to what they talk about the colonial thinking, you know, to this diversity or the plurality, you know. So we are being invited to go against, you know, what Chimamanda talks about, the dangers of a single story, you know, and we see this in the multiple narrative voices that are key in Ngũgĩ's works, you know. But I think it was important for him, Chinua Achebe, and the people of his generation, you know, to write back to the empire, you know, like this is what you have represented Africa to be, but this is our representation of what Africa is, you know, from our own perspective, you know, using your language, for example, you know, but to tell about our own experiences. Yes.
Okay, Mainom, this is going to be my last question. And Ngũgĩja Thiong'a is also known for his very famous book, actually, book of essays, like Decolonizing the Mind, right? Where he speaks about like a need that African writers, that African literature needs to be written in African languages. So, like, you know, I want to ask you, because like you are writing both in English and you are also writing in Gikuyu. So, can you tell us like the experience from, like, you know, from the first hand and the differences between it?
Yes, interesting one. Yes, Ngũgĩja has been key, you know, in promoting African languages in the writing of African literature, you know. But there's always a question about readership, you know. So when I write in Kikuyu, who is going to read my stuff? Who is going to read my books, you know? But this is changing. And I think the best example that we can talk about, you know, is South Africa. In South Africa, they never drop the ball. You know, literature in Zulu, Xhosa, Sotho continues up to date. And that's why South Africa is way ahead of the rest of Africa, because they didn't have that stop, you know, in countries like formerly ruled by the British or the French, you know. At independence, everybody wants to be French. Everyone wants to write the best French, you know. And at that moment, they forget about their local languages, you know, until Ngũgĩja comes up, you know, in the 80s, colonizing the mind, and decides that I'll be writing all my fiction, you know, in the Kikuyu language. In fact, not in 1986, no, 1977, when he wrote a play in Kikuyu, you know, and the government arrested him. And I think the most important, you know, they arrested him, one, because of the content, you know, of the play, but two, because of the reach of the play, that these people got. Ngũgĩja, as we're saying, is Marxist, no, always has professed Marxism, yeah. But this is a story about the peasants, you know, and Ngũgĩja made sure that this play got to the peasants themselves, you know, in the language that they could understand, you know, and I think that complicated, you know, the government in big ways, because the government role always is to keep the people ignorant about their conditions, you know. But now when you speak their language, you speak to them in their language, you know. So there's a change in that. So my experience as a Kikuyu writer, I think Kenya, for example, we are going through a reawakening, you know. What Kwame Nkrumah talked of Ghana, the cultural renaissance, you know, and people are finding value more, you know, in reading literature written in their languages, you know. But there's always a question. I have nephews and nieces, you know, who can neither speak, you know, nor read Kikuyu, you know. So it's like more or less like a dying generation. I don't know what will happen, you know, in the next, because most people like born in the urban areas, you know, they forget about their African languages, you know. But I think we should learn from South Africa that they are doing so well. I know so many. In fact, they even have awards, you know, of literature in African languages in South Africa. Kenya, we had to get there, you know, in East Africa. Apart from Swahili, you know, the other languages are kind of, you know, in the background. So it's a challenge. I do write. I published a poem in Kikuyu recently. I don't know. It was published in South Africa. I don't know who understands Kikuyu in South Africa, because Kikuyu is spoken in Kenya. So I don't know who I was addressing. You know, nobody has access to my, you know, and I don't know if this journal where I published, it got to Kenya, it got to my grandmother in the village to read my poem. I don't know. Those there are always questions about, yeah. And lastly, I think one day I'll share with you an article that I wrote. I think it was published. I don't remember. They're in Europe. I don't remember. And I'm questioning Ngũgĩja's use, for example, of Kikuyu words. No? I have. I hope he's not listening to me, but I have a problem and how he uses some of the words. You know, that if I take this word, yes, languages are dynamic; they grow. No? But if I take this word, for example, no, he is Kikuyunizing, no, if I can use that, some English words. No? So if I take that to my grandmother in the village, you know, who doesn't speak English, and I have Kikuyunized an English word, how is she going to connect with what I want to say, no. And Wizard of the Crow, for example, no, it's full of those Kikuyunized English words and stuff like that. But I'll send you my paper one day.
This is supposed to be a book promotion and not criticizing Ngũgĩja.
No. But I think it's key to think, to think about these things. Yeah. But Grain of Wheat for me remains my best book by Ngũgĩja, number one. And number two, not just I listened to. I think you've quoted the BBC documentary, where they say even Obama, when he was asked about his top 10 books, Grain of Wheat was there, So we are dealing with an international acclaimed, well-written, excellent novel that I would encourage everybody to read it, understand the history of Kenya, especially during the struggle for independence and shortly after. Yes.
Okay, thank you, dear Maina. I really appreciate your time, and your input was really insightful. So thank you again, also in the name of the audience, which you cannot see. But yeah, it was a great conversation, and thank you so much, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks so much, Anna, and thanks for inviting me. And I do hope that very soon you're going to translate more of Ngũgĩja's works, because I think Ngũgĩja is a must read for everyone. Yeah.
There is a publisher in the audience, so I think she heard your suggestion. So thank you so much.
Yes, you can ask her to work on I'll Marry When I Want. It's a very short play, but it's powerful. It's powerful. The one that made Ngũgĩja, that sent Ngũgĩja to detention. Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's a good suggestion, I believe. Yeah. So thank you so much, Maina.
Yes, yeah.
Have a great time.
Okay, thanks. Have a good evening, and thanks for having me as usual. Thanks so much. Asante sana.